Fyodor Dostoevsky is my favourite author, so today I thought we would take a look at some of his books and stories, and I would give my personal ranking of them, like in some kind of tier list. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. Okay, the first novel on our list is Poor Folk, and this is Dostoevsky's first novel, as far as I'm aware, and it's also the novel that sort of catapulted him into temporary stardom in the kind of literary world of St. Petersburg at that time. It was published in 1846, I think, and it follows just a deeply impoverished pair of people. So it's an epistolary novel. So the novel is just letters sent back and forth between these two characters. The first is Devushkin, who is a clerk and a very, very impoverished man, and the other is Varvara, who is a younger woman who is also in incredibly dire financial straits. And the kind of dynamic humming in the background is that Devushkin loves Varvara in a sort of timid, reserved kind of way, if that makes sense. He's not like doing passionate outbursts particularly, but he is sincerely, kind of adorably almost, in love with Varvara. And he can't be with her. This is partly because, she just sort of straightforwardly, it's not clear whether she shares the feeling. It's sort of basically, it's been a while since I've read this book, but from what I remember, it just isn't clear that she shares his romantic feelings at all. But also, he is just too impoverished, effectively, and he impoverishes himself further by buying her presents. He kind of sacrifices his own last vestiges of meager financial security out of this quite noble but quite destructive sort of love. And the novel, spoiler alert, ends very, very badly for both of them. So Varvara eventually marries a slightly roguish character who kind of comes in near the end, but is sort of a little bit more wealthy and could provide her with a significantly more comfortable life than Devushkin ever could. And Devushkin is just like completely shattered by this. He ends the novel in total misery, both sort of financially ruined, but he was sort of financially ruined at the start of the novel anyway, but also now having lost any hope of being with the woman that he loves. And even worse than that, the fact that the woman he loves is saddled to a character that he ultimately thinks is going to make her unhappy, even though he can provide for her materially. And that's probably a fair assessment. We're not given much reason to doubt that. The comparison that people tend to draw with this book is the works of Nikolai Gogol, who is a very socially conscious Russian author who's kind of the generation just before Dostoevsky. So he's really big at the time that Dostoevsky is this up-and-coming writer. I think that's a pretty fair comparison, and I don't mean that as a kind of criticism. Gogol is an astonishingly good writer. The only thing that I would say is that a lot of Gogol's novels are quite funny, and I wouldn't describe Poor Folk as funny. It is just relentlessly devastating. And I said at the beginning that this novel sort of catapulted Dostoevsky into a temporary kind of fame, and it was partly because he was sort of seen at this point as the next Gogol, the next kind of socially conscious, realistic author who's going to expose the terrible social conditions that many people in Russia were suffering under. Because we've got to remember, at the time that this is being written, Russia still has serfdom. So serfdom, for those of you who don't know, is a kind of feudal slavery. So we had it in the UK, but it was abolished hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And in Russia, it persisted right up to the mid-19th century. One of the things that Dostoevsky was really compassionate about as a young author and a young man was the abolition of serfdom. When he emerged from prison, so we'll get to Dostoevsky's imprisonment later in the video, but when Dostoevsky was released from his imprisonment and released from his exile and returned to St. Petersburg, one of the first things he did was celebrate the abolition of serfdom that had happened in his absence, because it was something he felt so very passionate about, which is kind of understandable, right? It's like millions of people just under this feudal form of slavery in a post-Enlightenment world. Though some people, I think, take this too far the other way. So some people try to draw a really neat distinction between the pre-imprisonment Dostoevsky, who is mostly concerned with social issues, and the post-imprisonment Dostoevsky, who is mostly concerned with spiritual issues. I actually think that Dostoevsky maintains quite an intense passion about social issues right the way through his works. You can see this in the treatment of poverty in something like Demons, for example, or the Marmeladovs in Crime and Punishment, where much of their misery is just caused by straightforward social poverty, right? I think it's a mistake to think that Dostoevsky stops caring about these social issues as time goes on. And I think that actually reading Poor Folk is a good way to tune your reading brain, I guess, into this theme, so that then when you approach some of Dostoevsky's later works, you remember that he's a kind of socially conscious author, because it can kind of get lost in the mix. Poor Folk, I think, is a pretty good book. It's certainly not my favorite Dostoevsky book by any means. As I said, it catapulted him into kind of a temporary celebrity status, because it was very, very popular with one of the top, if not the top, Russian literary critic at the time, who was a guy called Belinsky, who just absolutely loved the novel and, introduced Dostoevsky to all of these literary circles. And he was suddenly like a celebrated guy in St. Petersburg, although it's kind of a swings and roundabouts moment, because I also think that through this, Dostoevsky, I'm pretty sure, ended up meeting the circle of people, the Petrushevsky circle, who he would eventually get sent into Siberian prison for associating with. So, I don't know, man, be careful what you wish for. Having said that, I suppose, as we'll come on to say, that he probably wouldn't have become the astonishingly brilliant later author that he was without that prison stint. So, swings and roundabouts, and then further swings, I suppose. But anyway, I would probably put this on the B tier. I think that it is well worth reading, and I think that it's just generally worth reading some of Dostoevsky's earlier works, so that you can chart some of the through lines through to his later, more widely acclaimed masterpieces. I also think this just genuinely is a very good book. As I say, probably not my favorite Dostoevsky book by a long shot, but it is still very fantastic and very much worth reading. But if you want to be more conscious of the world around you, then you should check out today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app that gathers related articles from thousands of sources around the world in one place, so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. Each story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. Ground News are very kindly offering anyone who uses my link or scans my QR code 40% off their Vantage plan as a special deal, so I highly encourage you to snap this up. For example, let's see how left and right-leaning sources differed in how they reported a recent attack on US Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. Whereas left-leaning coverage emphasized Omar's statements after the attack, some right-leaning sources chose instead to focus on Trump's criticism of Omar. It's the same story, but with two very different elements highlighted. One of my favorite features for encouraging general critical thought about the world is the blind spots feed, because that highlights stories that are disproportionately covered by either the left or the right. It's so easy to get stuck in our own echo chambers, but this way we will learn about stories that might pass us by in our own news feeds. Like a lot of people, I don't have an awful lot of time to keep up with the news, and I don't know enough about every single news source to evaluate it for bias. So getting my Ground News Roundup dropped into my inbox every day is a big part of how I stay up to date generally with what's happening around the world. It makes it all seem just that little bit less bewildering. Ground News is giving my viewers 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. It's become an invaluable tool in helping me navigate our current, frankly insane information landscape, and I'm confident that you will find it helpful. But anyway, back to the video. Next up we have The Double. So this was the book he wrote immediately after Poor Folk, and it also precipitated his fall from grace within the literary world of St. Petersburg. So we saw how Poor Folk was seized upon by Belinsky and some other socially conscious Russian critics as, Dostoevsky was going to be the guy. It was going to be the new Gogol, the new socially conscious Russian author. And they kind of panned The Double. I'm probably exaggerating there. I mean, they didn't like it. They didn't like it nearly as much as Poor Folk. I think they viewed it as a bit sentimental, a bit romantic. It's a much more psychological novel. So The Double follows a kind of low-level civil servant named Golyadkin, who is a much less likable character than Devushkin. He's sort of characterized by this intense anxiety around status. So it's quite a relatable book, I think for a lot of people, just because I think that status anxiety is a huge thing. I mean, it probably always has been a huge thing, but I certainly notice it a lot in the modern world that it remains a huge thing, let's say, because I'm not going to claim that it got worse. And what happens is that Goliadkin sort of awakens one day to discover that there is another person who looks exactly like him and is also called Goliadkin, who is just like much better at everything than he is. And like they work at the same office and all sorts. And it is really funny at points, just because I think that's an inherently quite comic premise. And you can really see here the influence that certain magical realist authors have had on Dostoevsky. So, like, for example, this is an absurd thing that's happened, right? There's suddenly effectively a clone of Goliadkin wandering around. Nobody really acknowledges that. Like, it doesn't strike people as particularly strange. Some people have said that that's a comment on how within the kind of Russian bureaucratic system, people were interchangeable at that point. I don't know about that, but I do think that creates a sort of a wonderfully comic element. And also, it is probably Dostoevsky's most explicit time, where he uses the physical world around the characters in absurd ways to portray their psychological state. So, this double that Goliadkin has is very clearly like a commentary upon his status anxiety and loads of other things, but that's the thing I'm going to focus on here. His anxiety around being inadequate for his identity and his position. It's an identity threat. But it's not really the physical manifestation of that as a magically appearing double isn't something that we see in a lot of his other works. There's a short story called Bobok, I think I've got the name right there, that has kind of supernatural elements. And of course, there's the hallucinations of Ivan Karamazov. He hallucinates the devil, and that's potentially a kind of a supernatural element, though also could be interpreted as simply the physical effects of his distress manifesting psychologically. So, nobody else sees the devil, it's just him. But here we have like an outright supernatural element in a Dostoevsky book, and it's almost Kafkan. Having said that, I to be kind of brutally honest, this is probably my least favorite Dostoevsky book. It's certainly the thing that I've read by him that I've enjoyed the least. I think that it's really good. Like, it's still a Dostoevsky book, and as a result, it's still fantastic. I've never read anything by him where I've been like, that was rubbish. But it is, in my opinion, at the very least, not as good as some of his later works. Like, it's very interesting to read from a purely academic perspective, because you see the glimmers of what will become some of his fantastic kind of stock characters. Like, Goliadkin is in many ways a kind of proto-underground man, and yeah, I'd say largely a proto-underground man. I was going to say a proto-Raskolnikov, but I actually don't think that's as apt as I initially thought. So yeah, a kind of proto-underground man. And I think that's very interesting. It's very interesting to see the origins of a character that will later come on to reach a climax in Notes from Underground, which of course we'll talk about later in the video. Having said that, yeah, I didn't enjoy it as much as I've enjoyed Dostoevsky's other books. So I'm going to put it in the C tier. And I feel very mean doing that, because it's still like a really great book. But if I don't put something in the C tier, then it's just going to be like straight A's and S tiers. And that can't possibly fly. That'll be the kind of the dullest tier list video ever. So I've got to be pretty strict with myself. So yeah, that's where I'm placing this book. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing, either to the channel, or if you're feeling incredibly generous and want to gain access to exclusive content, including my slow motion book-by-book bookshelf tour, then consider subscribing to the Patreon, though it's absolutely no pressure. The links are in the description. But anyway, our next one is White Knight. So I've talked about this an awful lot on the channel before, so I'm not gonna bang on about it too much here. But effectively, White Knight follows another kind of romantic pairing, or semi-romantic pairing. We have one in Poor Folk, we've got another in White Knights, but they're taken in very different directions. Between a nameless narrator and a woman called Nastenka, who is sort of waiting during the White Nights of Petersburg, which is where the sun doesn't quite set, so you kind of have this glow in the sky all night. She's waiting for her lover, who said that he would return to her, and he hasn't. And our narrator comforts her for the first night and then gradually falls in love with her. And he builds this grand narrative in his head that they're going to be together. And then her lover returns, and she goes with him. And, a lot of people say that this story is like incel-y. I cannot disagree more with that take. If you look at what the narrator says at the end of the novel, he continues to wish the lover and Nastenka well in their future. But he is devastated, and he's very innocently devastated. And ultimately, a lot of this is because of the way that he has narrativized all of these experiences over the prior 4 days. One of the final lines of the novel is where he goes, actually, I've got this on my desk, so I'm just gonna read it. My God, a whole minute of bliss, is that really so little for the whole of a man's life? So, the idea there being that he thinks that this has in some way justified his existence. That turns him into quite a tragic figure. In some ways, the narrator of the White Knights is also a kind of prefiguring of the underground man, but in a very different direction. The narrator of White Knights is caught up in dreams. He's the dreamer. That's kind of his archetype, I suppose. And in many ways, the underground man is like that as well. He just has much darker and more insidious dreams. So I really like White Knights. I like how it manages to be both a really lovely love story from one person's perspective and then snatches that all away right at the end, but without doing the kind of simplistic woe is me framing whereby the protagonist is a kind of wronged person and he's been done over by this bastard who's run off with another guy. It's much, much more gently treated than that. And I really like that. I think it's probably one of my favorite stories about romance ever, even though it's kind of an anti-romantic story. So this is going straight in the A tier for me. It's my favorite of Dostoevsky's pre-imprisonment works, and I love it. I'd highly recommend everyone read it. I did a video on it ages ago, at the beginning of 2024. So, God, yeah, ages ago now. And I was quite lucky. I caught a totally incidental wave of popularity for White Knight. So that video ended up kind of loads of people ended up watching it, which was very kind of them. But yeah, I think because they reprinted White Knights in these kind of mini Penguin Classics versions. They're called the Little Black Classics. And I think they just sold like hotcakes. And I think that was kind of why it ended up it was very fortuitous timing. But yeah, I'm glad that so many people are reading it because I think that it's a fantastic novel. And I love it would have been so easy to make the main character resentful at the end or to paint Nastenka as horrible. And I'm so glad that he didn't do that. Again, I suppose, he wouldn't be Dostoevsky if he did that kind of thing. But I think that's absolutely fantastic. Right, next we have The House of the Dead, or Notes from a Dead House. This is going straight into the S tier. I think this is by far the most underrated Dostoevsky book ever. It was Tolstoy's favorite Dostoevsky book, incidentally, and also Nietzsche was a huge fan of this book as well. And for good reason. It is essentially a semi-fictionalized memoir about Dostoevsky's time in prison. And it's just brilliant. It's probably the novel that draws most from Dostoevsky's personal experience. So many of these are things that Dostoevsky himself went through in prison while he was, to give some background here, when Dostoevsky was part of the Petrushevsky Circle, they were all arrested and they were told they were going to be executed. And then at the last minute, they were given a reprieve and they were sent to prison for various amounts of time. I think Petrushevsky was sent for life and Dostoevsky got 4 years imprisonment in Siberia and then was also going to be a conscript he ended up, I think, being a conscript for 6 years after that. I don't know if that length of time was specified in his original sentence. But either way, he spent 4 years in this absolutely brutal prison system, like Tsarist Russian prison system. It's just absolutely horrible. Far worse than almost any prison that you'd be sent to in the Western world today. And, the prisoners were beaten. There were constant fights between prisoners. Prisoners would be kind of spent, if they got any money, they would just immediately spend it on getting really drunk. There's this one character in the book who, whenever he got any money, would immediately get incredibly blackout drunk and would start fighting other prisoners until the other prisoners beat him into unconsciousness. And then he'd just get up the next morning and pretend that nothing had happened. And it's just there are so many fantastic character portraits. I think you can tell that this time in prison is where Dostoevsky really honed his observational psychological lens on the world, because all of the characters in Notes from a Dead House, or The House of the Dead, or whatever you want to call it, are so realistic that even when they're behaving in seemingly absurd ways, you can just tell that there's a whole flesh and blood person there. I think it's absolutely fantastic. It's such an easy S tier because, again, I think it's so underrated. If you haven't read this book, you absolutely need to read this book. A lot of people complain because it doesn't really have a plot, But I would just think of it as a memoir rather than a straightforward story. But it's amazing. I can't really put into words how amazing it is. This is also where Dostoevsky's strength of belief in the power of faith was cemented. So there's this incredibly moving passage where all of these murderers and bandits and thieves and robbers, it's Easter, and they're standing in the church, and they're standing kind of in the presence of the Eucharist and in the context of the service. And all of a sudden, all of their kind of violence and the kind of the felt shame and depravity of their situation, all of that just kind of melts away. And Dostoevsky sees like murderers who had previously been unrepentant suddenly humbled and on their knees. And this clearly has a huge effect on him. And I think it's one of the reasons why he becomes so critical of overly rationalistic approaches to people and to the world in his later works, because I think experiences like this really cement the idea that this sort of, mystical, intense emotional experience is just has a potential for transformative change that he didn't acknowledge before he was in prison, and is frustrated when he emerges from prison that other people don't quite pay as much heed to. It's also just a very good book to get out of the habit, say, of thinking things like, Dostoevsky says this and Dostoevsky says that, but this guy'd never really been through anything, why should we listen to him? No, Dostoevsky went through like hell and back in this prison. He describes it to his brother as like having been dead for 4 years. And it's just such a good meditation on suffering and redemption and cruelty. One of the characters is this incredibly cruel governor of the prison, and Dostoevsky explores how power makes him so vicious. And likewise, he meets characters who are psychopaths and characters who seem like they're going to be psychopaths, but are actually have depth of character that he would have never realized that they had were he not forced to be in proximity with them for years. Another really good sequence is when they put on a show, like the prisoners put on a play. And again, it's just like, the reason that I love this book so much is because Dostoevsky neither shies away from depicting the absolute brutality and horror of the situation that they're all in, and the horror of some of the people, right? As I say, some of whom are just unrepentant killers. But he also doesn't shy away from presenting their humanity as well. You get just a real sense of their well-rounded personhood. That's why I put Notes from a Dead House in the S tier, and why I will not stop going on about it, no matter how much anyone tries, because I think that it is both absolutely integral to understanding Dostoevsky's later work, but also I think it is just a fantastic piece of work in its own right. And I think because it's not as traditionally novel-esque as a lot of his other works, it gets skimmed over when it absolutely shouldn't get skimmed over. It's a complete work of genius, and yeah, easy S tier. Okay, next up we have The Gambler. So this is a novella also released after Dostoevsky's imprisonment, and it's another very, very personal work. So this is Dostoevsky reflecting in many ways on his own gambling addiction. This book was actually written in order to pay off Dostoevsky's gambling debts. And it's a very, very personal novel, and I would say it's one of his, it's a very, very good novel. It's not one of my like massive favorites, but it does deal with some themes that aren't necessarily dealt with many other places. So money is really prevalent in The Gambler as a theme. Here, money takes center stage. In many ways, all of the characters in The Gambler are defined by their relationship to money. The main character is a tutor called Alexei, and he there's a love story in there. So he loves a young woman, and he wants to become kind of worthy of her, and he sees this worthiness in monetary terms, and eventually he manages it. He goes on a kind of gambling spree and gets lucky and wins, but then that high becomes the next thing that he's after, and so he keeps going. All he lives for is this gambling habit. And I think really you do get a sense of what it was like being Dostoevsky mired in a gambling addiction and seemingly finding it incredibly difficult to do anything about it. It's not one of my favorites. I'd probably put it in the B tier, but I think that it is a good thing to read to specifically look at Dostoevsky's experiences as a gambling addict and also the way that money fits into his general existential approach. And also, I think at the later parts of The Gambler, you get a little bit more of that Notes from Underground Man feel. You know, you see a broken guy, kind of somebody who's had their kind of identity torn apart at the seams. And yeah, there's some kind of classic Dostoevsky intense psychological suffering there. And yeah, I think there are also some themes of responsibility in The Gambler that I think become more important in Dostoevsky's work post this point. But as I say, The Gambler is definitely still worth reading, although it's probably not my favorite book, and I would definitely put it in the B tier. After this, we have The Meek One. So this doesn't often appear in great lists of Dostoevsky's, best work and things like that. I think that's a mistake. I think The Meek One is very, very good. It's a very short story. It's only about 30 pages. And it basically depicts a kind of horribly abusive marriage between a man who is insecure and as a result feels the need to control everyone around him, including his bride. And it's sort of about how he just pushes her to the limit. I don't want to spoil it because the ending of the novel's in like the first 2 pages. But I just want to allow you to experience it for yourself. Because as I say, it's very short. Literally, you can pause this video and go and read it. The thing that I like about it is that it's told from the perspective of this kind of quite, quote unquote narcissistic, but highly kind of abusive and controlling guy. I like that it's told from his perspective and not from the perspective of the person that implicitly we're kind of rooting for as a reader, his poor wife. It's very unpleasant to be in the mind of such an unpleasant character. At the same time, you sort of end up in the position of his manipulated victim by virtue of the fact that the world's being presented from his perspective. It's a very, very good example of an unreliable narrator in Dostoevsky's stories, which does become like a more prominent theme in a few of his later works. But here I actually think he does it best. I think the unreliable narrator in The Meek One is fantastic. And you just get this kind of slow reveal that as long as you're kind of paying attention to the story, as it becomes clear to you as a reader that you are reading the account of a monster describing his own monstrous deeds and just slightly unable to recognize them as monstrous. I know, I think that it is, I think it's, again, deals with a lot of themes that aren't necessarily present in a lot of other Dostoevsky books. I also just think it's incredibly easy to read. And there's so much to kind of cogitate on there. It's not like it has the final word to do with, what dynamics of abuse are like or anything like that. But the story will stick with you. And it's a real tale of despair. And unlike a lot of Dostoevsky's other novels, it doesn't have that much hope in, which is why I probably wouldn't put it in S tier, because I actually really like the kind of hopeful nature of Dostoevsky's writings. I will still maintain that Dostoevsky is, at bottom, a real optimist about the world. So it's going in the A tier. I'd highly recommend you read it. I'm not going to say any more about it. And let's move on to the next one. Right, next up we have Notes from Underground, or Notes from the Underground as it's sometimes known. This is obviously a fantastic book. I feel like I am going on about it an awful lot, so I won't say too much here. But effectively, Notes from Underground follows first in a sort of philosophical manifesto form, and then after that as a sort of set of little vignettes, little individual stories. It tells the tale of the underground man who introduces himself by saying that he is sick, spiteful, and unattractive, which is just such an amazing opening. And effectively, the rest of the novella details exactly how he manages to be so incredibly self-destructive and also destructive to the people around him. But yeah, most of all self-destructive. He really does make himself much more miserable than he makes anyone else. And yeah, the underground man is just hateable in every way, but also strangely relatable. An important thing that I don't mention here, but I do mention on my longer video on Notes from Underground, is that this is also sort of explicitly a response to a contemporary Russian author and thinker called Chernyshevsky, who was what's called a utopian socialist, which is a type of socialist that wrote at the time. But more importantly, for the purposes of Notes from Underground, he was a big believer in the ability of mankind to totally constrain any kind of irrationality and merely pursue what he called rational self-interest. So, as you can imagine, that didn't really chime with Dostoevsky's personal assessment of human psychology and spirituality. There's a reason why this is one of Dostoevsky's most popular books. It is definitely him, I would argue, at his most dark. It really is a very, very bleak novella. Reportedly, Dostoevsky initially was going to have a section whereby the underground man engaged with Christianity, and maybe that was going to be the sort of the hopeful part of it. As I'll go on to say later in the video, I think that actually one of the underrated characteristics of Dostoevsky as a writer, one of the reasons why I love him so much, is actually his optimism, his surprising faith in humanity, even when he is painting it sort of at its worst. And I kind of wish that was in there, because I love Notes from Underground. I think it is one of the greatest books ever written, and certainly one of the most psychologically insightful books ever written. It is basically impossible to come away from reading Notes from Underground not being changed in some way. At the same time, it's one of the only Dostoevsky books in this later period that is missing that glimmer of optimistic hope that I think sort of transforms Dostoevsky's works from merely being psychologically insightful and a kind of incredible philosophical treatise on misery and darkness and depravity into being that, as well as realistic kind of optimism for the future that's nonetheless grounded in Dostoevsky's Orthodox Christian faith. And for me, my favorite parts of Dostoevsky are when those two play off one another perfectly. And in Notes from Underground, you largely have the dark side and you don't so much have the optimistic side. I still think that it is probably bang for your buck, I suppose, like per page, the most life-changing Dostoevsky book. Partly that's because it's so short. It's only about 120 pages. And everyone I've ever spoken to who I've recommended this book to and has then gone away and read it and come back has said, this changed me. And I kind of don't know what more you can ask for of a novel, which is why my ranking is going to be so incredibly controversial here, I predict, because I'm going to put it in the A tier. And this could easily go in A or S tier. The only thing for me that would stop this entering into the S tier is just the cut chapter, because this chapter where the underground man was going to engage with Christianity, and potentially that would be the sort of glimmer of hope in the darkness, was cut by the Tsar's censors, which I think is really interesting. I would love to read their report on that or something. I think that would be exceptionally interesting. Right, next up we have Crime and Punishment. And this is hardly controversial. I'm going to put this in the S tier for pretty obvious reasons. I think that Crime and Punishment is the most tightly plotted Dostoevsky book out of the ones that I've read, because there are ones I haven't read, like I haven't read The Adolescent, for example. And this is I think, has such a tight plot. Obviously, this isn't really giving spoilers away because these are all events that take part in the very first section of the book. It follows our protagonist, Rodion Raskolnikov, as he decides and then subsequently carries out the murder of a pawnbroker and also the pawnbroker's sister, who just kind of doesn't get brought up that much later in the novel. Sonia knows her, but apart from that, doesn't get brought up an awful lot. But anyway, Raskolnikov kills these two old women, one of whom, the pawnbroker, is sort of a wretched, horrible person. And that's one of the ways in which Raskolnikov justifies to himself that he's going to commit this murder. And he also says all kinds of things. Like he says he's going to take the money that he steals from her and he's going to use it to change the world. And he also has this theory that there are extraordinary men and there are ordinary men. And ordinary men are bound by morality, but extraordinary men can rise above this. They have the kind of psychological and a spiritual constitution almost to rise above this and discard the old morality and simply just impose their will on the world. And Raskolnikov carries this out as a kind of personal experiment to see if he is one of these extraordinary men, as well as all of these other motives he has mixed in, some of which he later admits to Sonia are a bit of self-deception, a kind of PR gloss over his real motives. And then the rest of the novel is how he reacts to this. How, the crime in Crime and Punishment is the murder, but the punishment isn't, some kind of prison sentence or execution or anything like that. I won't spoil what happens regarding that. But it is Raskolnikov slowly and gradually tormenting himself psychologically over what he's done, his inability to bear the weight of his own actions. And there's just so much in this novel. But the reason why I would put this in the S tier is because out of all of Dostoevsky's novels, this is the one that I think most of the virtues of a very, very tight and fast-moving plot. And as a result, I think, similar to Notes from Underground, I think anyone could pick up and read it, but Crime and Punishment is like 500 pages, and it will keep you entertained as well as, edified and psychologically incited, I guess, at every single page in the book. If you are like a fan of relatively fast-paced stories, then Dostoevsky generally moves at a much slower pace than you might be used to. But Crime and Punishment genuinely is incredibly fast-paced, and I would highly, highly recommend it for that reason. I also think that it's not the first appearance of the notion of radical forgiveness as a theme in Dostoevsky, but it is where that theme first develops into its final form, almost. Again, I can't say too much without spoiling it, so let's just say spoilers ahead for the end of Crime and Punishment. Effectively, Raskolnikov is redeemed. He finds redemption in the love of Sonia, who is a fallen woman. She's a prostitute. But nonetheless, she has a kind of a heart of gold. She is the closest character in the novel to Christ, even though she is a prostitute. And, we could talk about all kinds of ways in which that is, potentially wonderfully subversive and brilliant, a sort of brilliant way to clash two different intuitions, one of which coming from Christianity and the other of which maybe coming from a sort of inherited morality of society. So I think that's an excellent choice anyway. But it is through this redeeming love that Raskolnikov finds it in his heart to not so much forgive himself, but to see himself as redeemable and begin to work towards that redemption. The final part of Crime and Punishment, again, massive spoilers ahead, is Raskolnikov reflecting on how he is going to change moving forward, effectively. So he's looking back and he's sort of beginning to look forward as to the man that he will become at some point, hopefully with the redeeming love of Sonia, and also he reads the New Testament in prison, which is where he ends up, but with a shorter prison sentence because he hands himself in. So there is a kind of life, a future life that he can look towards. And the novel ends by basically saying, yeah, that's another story. We've told the story of Raskolnikov's Crime and Punishment, and he will go on into the future. There will be another tale, not written by Dostoevsky, but there will be another tale of where Raskolnikov goes from here. So yeah, Crime and Punishment, absolutely exceptional, going straight in the S tier. And let's move on to the next one. Okay, the next book on our list is The Idiot. And this is my second favorite Dostoevsky book. And I think because out of all of Dostoevsky's books, apart from The Brothers Karamazov, I think this is the one that has the most light in it. Even if, semi-spoiler alert, I suppose, by the end of the novel, that light has significantly dimmed. The titular idiot is Prince Lev Nikolaevich Mishkin, and the title is a little bit ironic because actually, Prince Mishkin is not an idiot at all. Many characters underestimate him. They consider him to be some kind of fool or idiot. But in fact, Prince Mishkin is Christ-like. He is... Dostoevsky says that he set out to write a novel about a kind of perfectly beautiful man. And this was what Prince Mishkin ended up being. He is, if you're going to summarize his character in a few words, you probably say something like he is Christ-like, but without any of the kind of divinity or divine power of Christ. So he is endlessly forgiving. He even forgives the man who tried to murder him, and endlessly self-sacrificial and endlessly tries to be kind. And this, again, spoiler alert, broadly just doesn't go that well for him. So he ends the novel, I'm going to leave a pause there so that people can pause or skip ahead, in an insane asylum. He's been totally broken by the way that upper-class Russian society has treated him, because they've essentially taken that kindness and in some way thrown it back in his face or been unable to understand it, or at points he has been acting what we would consider to be virtuously perfect, but because of the fact that the people around him have all of their own psychological issues and their own unique flavors of brokenness, they respond to that in horribly self-destructive ways. So the most interesting character in The Idiot maybe it's Mishkin, but also it is the female protagonist, Nastasia Filipovna, because this is, apart from the Underground Man, maybe, Dostoevsky's most self-destructive character. But unlike the Underground Man, Nastasia Filipovna has an awful lot of sympathy. She was basically abused as a child and carries the shame and inner torment of this throughout her entire life, to the point when Mishkin shows her kindness and selflessness and generosity, she just doesn't really know how to process it. She finds it bewildering and runs from it in a way that, a certain kind of, I would say, relatively shallow or unsympathetic reader might say, oh, well, why has she done that? It's her own fault. But I think that this gets to something really psychologically astute in the narrative or the self-narrative of self-destruction, which is that you can, I think, get to the point where you consider yourself so wretched and so unlovable and so unforgivable that kindness and generosity itself becomes sort of painful to receive, because with every kind act that is lumped upon you against your will, you feel like you have to exact a sort of compensatory punishment within your own mind in order to kind of redress the karmic balance of the universe almost. And Nastasia is a lot like that. And I think we've all had moments like that. But Nastasia is mired in this mental state, and it makes her endlessly fascinating and tragic. And in many ways, whereas Prince Myshkin is quite a static protagonist, Nastasia Filipovna goes through some character development. She changes and evolves, but ultimately, again, spoiler alert, remains tragically stuck in the old paradigm. The reason that I love The Idiot, and it is probably my second favorite Dostoevsky novel, is that it dignifies failure in a way that I find incredibly compelling. So all of the characters, well, not all the characters, Myshkin and Nastasia, they both get close enough to achieving their aims, both of which are relatively noble aims. Nastasia, ultimately, she wants happiness and recovery from the horrible things that have happened to her. And Myshkin wants to help her, and he wants to be kind to people, and that's driving him. These are really noble goals. And they both get so close to them and then just fail. And the book ends with every character so much worse off than when they started. Apart from a few. There's the old character who ends up better off, but for most of our main protagonists, they end up in such a worse position than when they started. And the big question hanging in the air at the end of the book is, should Myshkin have acted in the way he did? Should he have been, unthinkingly kind and noble and generous, considering that not only did it blow up in his face, it blew up in the faces of the people he was trying to help? I think that's a fascinating question. I think that it raises all kinds of important philosophical and simply prudential questions about the possible need to balance kindness with a sort of realpolitik approach to the world, whether that's the right thing to do, whether we should continue to strive to be Myshkin-esque in our kindness, even though we know that a certain amount of the time that's going to completely blow up in our face. It is, in a lot of ways, Dostoevsky's answer to the question, if Christ wasn't divine, should we still imitate him? And I'd say that his answer is yes. I think that's... I think the answer is yes, but the novel would leave you unsure. And I think that that's really important. I think that one of the great things about The Idiot is that it just isn't a book of any easy answers. It is not preachy, and none of Dostoevsky's books, I think, are particularly preachy, but The Idiot really isn't preachy. The Idiot is an incredibly dialectical novel, I suppose, in that sense. It provides you with a whole series of viewpoints, and you are left to sort out the mess. And I love that. I think that it is a novel that is good at provoking your own philosophy, and eminently practical philosophy as well. So this is going straight in the S tier, and I think this is brilliant. The only thing that I would say is that in many ways it is, if you're not used to Dostoevsky, it can be a slightly more a less tight reading experience than, say, Crime and Punishment or Notes from Underground, or even even Demons, which is the next book we're going to talk about, because Dostoevsky just did not plan this book in advance at all. He basically just created the characters and was then like, right, I'm going to put them in a bunch of situations, I'm going to see what happens. I really like that. It's really not everyone's cup of tea, and I think that's totally fine. You're not like, it's not a character fault or some kind of, intellectual deficiency to like want your novel that you're reading to like have a well planned out plot. I think that is an eminently reasonable expectation. For me, the idiot manages to overcome all that, but I feel like I should warn anyone going in that if you get 350 pages into the book and you're not quite sure what the overarching plot is, that's fine, and you'll continue to have that feeling. I think that the book makes up for that with its depth and interest, but it may not for you, and that's absolutely fine. Okay, next up we have Demons, and this is the closest thing that Dostoevsky has to a political thriller. It's a very, very cool book, very, very different to a lot of Dostoevsky's other works, I would say. And it follows three main characters, I would say. There is Stepan Trofimovich. I've tried to say that loads of times, and my editor will have wonderfully cut that out of the recording. There is Nikolai Vsevolodovich, which I've definitely messed up the pronunciation of. And then there is Pyotr Stepanovich, who is Stepan Trofimovich's son. Those are like the three characters that we probably spend the most time around. And they're all very, very interesting. Pyotr Stepanovich wants to start a revolution. He's a sort of... He is a nihilist revolutionary, and moreover, he is Dostoevsky's idea of a nihilist revolutionary, which probably isn't how the nihilist revolutionaries would have painted themselves. But he's a very interesting character, and I do think that Dostoevsky doesn't just simply make him out to be a monster. Despite the book's title being Demons, all the characters in this novel, even the quote-unquote villains, not quote-unquote, they're definitely villains, have an awful lot of depth to them. Nikolai Stavrogin is probably Dostoevsky's most in-depth look at a really, really nasty individual, but a nasty individual who is nasty, and the philosophical underpinning for that is a kind of hopeless nihilism. Very, very interesting character. I can't really say that much about him without just like completely spoiling the novel, and unlike a lot of the other of Dostoevsky's novels, the plot to Demons is both amazing, incredibly complex, and I've said both, but there is a third thing, really, really integral to the enjoyability of the book. So I am going to keep this relatively brief. I would just generally say that if you want something social and political in Dostoevsky, then Demons is an excellent choice. It's very thrilling. There's a lot in there about Dostoevsky's critique of intellectuals and Dostoevsky's critique of nihilism and atheism, and where he thinks those forces will lead, which I find very interesting. Right? I like to read Demons because I am an agnostic. I don't believe in God. And seeing where Dostoevsky thinks that kind of thinking can lead, at the very least, I find very informative. I like being criticized by great thinkers of the past, and Dostoevsky's Demons does that wonderfully. This is going in the A tier. I'm going to write a video on it, actually. Well, actually, no, I've started writing the video on it. I've not got very far, so that might be a while. I imagine that it'll probably be done at sort of around the end of March. This is the third time that I've read Demons, and I think that I have something to say about it now. I read it twice, sort of partly with the mind of, I'll write a video on this. It was the only one of the big four that I hadn't read, and so I thought, right, this would be great. I'll read it, I'll digest it, I'll write a video on it. Demons is, in my mind, the most complicated Dostoevsky book to unpick the philosophy of. So also, I'd bear that in mind if you do choose to read it. But third time round, I think I have something to say. Again, it'll be a while till that's finished, because when I'm writing a very long video, I like to let the ideas kind of marinate for a while, because I often spot loads and loads of flaws in them. But yeah, this is going the A tier. I highly recommend it. But I would say that it probably was the most difficult Dostoevsky novel for me personally. And you might find the same. So if you're finding it very hard, even if you've read a lot of Dostoevsky before, don't be surprised. It just is a very hard book. Okay, and finally, we have The Brothers Karamazov. This is going straight in the S tier. Not only is it my favorite Dostoevsky book, it is my favorite book. It's absolutely fantastic. It is the climax to everything that Dostoevsky has been talking about for all of his previous works, especially his works post-imprisonment. It has themes of nihilism. It deals with the problem of evil. That's kind of a question that frames the entire book. How can Dostoevsky himself reconcile his faith in God with the fact that there is evil and suffering in the world, and that people make evil choices? In the character of the elder Zosima, you have probably the closest thing that Dostoevsky ever has in his novels to a mouthpiece for his own ideals. And that's very interesting in its own right. It feels like Dostoevsky is sort of being straight with you when he's talking through the mouthpiece of the elder Zosima. And I think that's very, very valuable. The Brothers Karamazov is also just jam-packed full of characters that you'll fall in love with. Most obviously, there's Alyosha. That's the youngest Karamazov brother. And he's just so lovely. He's sort of the evolution of Prince Myshkin as a character. But unlike Prince Myshkin, Alyosha is just a little bit more human, because he struggles. He really, really struggles with his own faith and his own kindness and his own striving towards being virtuous. Whereas Prince Myshkin is often basically just effortless in that quest, even though that takes him to a horrible place. You see Alyosha struggle with many of the questions that you would struggle with if you decided you were going to make it your life's mission to actively love everyone and everything in the world. I mean, that's a hard mission, and the character of Alyosha shows the difficulty of that mission in full breadth and detail, or full depth and detail, I should say, and I absolutely love that. The character of Dmitri is the more passionate of the Brothers Karamazov, and he is lovable in his own way. He goes through a lot in the book. Again, I don't want to spoil it too much, but he is, again, you can kind of learn everything from these characters. Alyosha is, for me, a great person to try to emulate. I try and fail to emulate Alyosha an awful lot. Dmitri is a brilliant philosophical exploration of all the upsides and downfalls of passion in a person. Dmitri is defined by his passion, his passionate love, his passionate action, his passionate sense of honor and wrath and pleasure and anger. And Dostoevsky explores all of those emotions in such tantalizing depth and detail that you learn to love them and also see their flaws. And because we all have those emotions inside of us, that becomes an immensely helpful self-reflective exercise. Ivan Karamazov is the Karamazov brother that gets quoted the most on social media because he's a sort of evolution of Raskolnikov a little bit, in that he is an atheist, he's a kind of quasi-nihilist, and a lot of his arc is teasing out the consequences of that and whether he can live with them. And yeah, I'm an agnostic, so I really enjoy it when Dostoevsky gives sympathetic but critical treatments of unbelief, and specifically not believing in transcendence, and placing a lot of faith in the ability of mankind to craft its own values and govern itself, because those are things that I believe, and the things that Ivan believes as well. And it doesn't massively go totally well for him. Again, I'm not going to spoil it too much here. And I like that element of critique in it. There are also just loads of wonderful subplots. There's a subplot with a group of children, and one of them falls horribly ill, and Alyosha interacts with those children and helps them deal with that. There's the subplot of the elder Zosima and his, spoiler alert, death, and how Alyosha reacts to that. The whole of one of the final books is an extended court case, because the Brothers Karamazov revolves around a murder. I won't tell you any more than that, but it does revolve around a murder. And there you see all of the petty human ambitions that might go on in a high-profile court case laid bare by Dostoevsky's pen. And I absolutely love that. You kind of, as you go through the Brothers Karamazov, there are so many lines that it almost feels like are crafted exactly for you. I wrote a video on Montaigne a while ago, and there are loads of people who read Montaigne and say, oh my God, it feels like he's talking directly to me. And I think the Brothers Karamazov has the same kind of thing. The only thing that I would bear in mind, it moves at a very, very slow pace. A lot happens psychologically and less happens physically for most of the book. I would encourage you, if you're finding it very, very slow, to think of the novel as framed by psychological events rather than physical events and see if that helps. Because psychologically, it's incredibly fast-paced. Just loads of things happen. But physically, things really do crawl along. And a lot of people find that frustrating. Again, it sometimes helps to consider this as a book of psychological development and psychological events and philosophical arguments. It's Dostoevsky writes what are sometimes called polyphonic novels, and this is probably his most polyphonic novel because you get so many different viewpoints and so many different arguments and so many different emotional perspectives on the world. And you see them clash and you see them converse. And again, much like The Idiot, there are no easy answers. There is only the struggle of seeing these ideas clash and deciding what you think about them. One of my favorite things about the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard is that he wrote so much of his work under pseudonyms and plays those pseudonyms off against one another in order to encourage the individual self-reflection of his readers. And the Brothers Karamazov does that very, very well. So, for me, it is the greatest novel of all time. It has all of the virtues of a Socratic dialogue and all of the psychological brilliance of Dostoevsky's writing and all of the philosophical depth that you could ask for. So yes, absolutely S tier, would highly recommend it. And yes, I'd even say that the Brothers Karamazov is incredibly readable. So even if you've not picked up much Dostoevsky before, I would say give it a go. I really think you'll like it. Okay, that is our list. We've not included every Dostoevsky book here. We've not even included all of the Dostoevsky stories that I've read, because there are some like The Dream of a Ridiculous Man or Bobok that I just thought we'd leave out. But I hope that you've enjoyed the video. I hope this has given you some flavor of what each Dostoevsky book is about. And I hope that by the end of this, you will feel inspired to pick up one of the Dostoevsky books that you may not have encountered or read before. If you want to see another one of these tier list videos, I think they're quite fun, then you can check out this one where I rank ethical dilemmas and we go through a few of them together. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day.